Welcome back to Critic Proof. I'm your host, Alyssa Rosenberg, the culture critic at Think Progress and a columnist at Slate's XX Factor. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Sonny Bunch, the managing editor at the Washington Free Beacon, to talk about, of all timely topics, superhero movies. So we both saw Man of Steel last week, and it's been a very interesting movie, and not so much almost to watch, but to watch the reaction to, because it's been very divided. And I think you and I are maybe two of the people who liked the movie most, and I want to let you get started and talk about why.
Sure. I was also very surprised by the reaction. It is, at the very least, an extremely competently made, extremely entertaining film. I think you know what you're getting into when you hear Zack Snyder directed, Christopher Nolan produced Superman film, right? You're going to have...
Or you would think you know what you're getting.
You would think so. Maybe I overestimate the public and the critical class. It's a movie that has ideas, and it has not just ideas, but ideas that can be interpreted many different ways. I mean, for instance, I think the best piece I've seen on it went up today at Jacobin, which is, not exactly a magazine I'm going to agree with a lot of the time, and I agree with very little that the reviewer said, but at the same time, it was an interesting take, and, I am a little bit flummoxed by the criticism, and the criticism breaks down in two different ways, right? You've got the critics who are saying, oh, it's just another big, splashy action movie, and okay, I kind of disagree with that, but whatever. And then you have kind of the comic, and I use this in the nicest way possible because I am one, but the comic nerd class breakdown of people who don't like the ending. And can we talk about the ending here?
I think if at this point you're listening to a 45-minute podcast about Man of Steel and you have not watched Man of Steel, I recommend that you buy a ticket, go see Man of Steel, and then come back and listen to us talk. So
that's a smart take. I think a lot of people have complained about Superman killing General Zod at the end of the film, which they say it's a violation of the character, and they say it's, this is not what Superman is, and I just kind of want to respond to them, grow up,
But also, isn't there a storyline where, in the comics, where Superman ultimately decides that the only option that is available to him is to execute Zod and his counterparts? I mean, there's some basis for this, as I understand from my boyfriend, who's a bigger comics geek than I am.
So there is that storyline, but also in the Richard Donner Superman, which everybody points to as, this is the classic take on the character, Superman throws Zod into a bottomless chasm at the end of their fight. He doesn't, it's not as, visceral and problematic, but he deals with the Kryptonians in a pretty similar manner. Yeah. And, so, whatever.
The idea that there's an enormous world of moral difference between snapping a guy's neck to keep him from murdering civilians, something that he has said he will explicitly do, versus, throwing him in a pit and letting the pit do the dirty work, doesn't seem terribly morally relevant. It was an interesting movie for me to watch. I think, I want to go back to a point that you made about it being sort of just another sort of summer action movie. And I wonder if one of the problems that we've gotten into, and I say this as someone who loves issues in my superhero movies, who loves issues in my movies, period, because it gives me things to write about, I'm not really sure what's wrong with just being a solid action picture. And I would argue that Man of Steel is actually more than a solid action picture. Zack Snyder has a very distinctive sort of action choreography style. His fight coordinator on Man of Steel has worked with him on Sucker Punch and Watchmen and 300, so there's a real sort of continuity here. And part of what was fun for me about Man of Steel is that it's a movie where the character matches Snyder's style really well. He likes sort of big, over-the-top, kind of crunchy, almost physically unbelievable sequences. You have a lot of really dramatic leaping in 300 and in Sucker Punch, both of which are movies that involve, humans as opposed to people from other planets who have enhanced physical capacities. And sometimes that looked ridiculous in his prior movies. In Superman, you have these fights that are occurring on the edge of human plausibility because that's how a clash between people who are functionally gods would look to normal humans. I mean, I think it's sort of unfortunate to treat action as if it's sort of a lesser pursuit than storytelling when it's a very difficult cinematic element to pull off well. And I actually thought that was part of what was exciting, is sort of a final match between a director's style and subject matter.
I think that's a very, very good point. I mean, like you say, Zack Snyder, when you're watching a Zack Snyder film, it is very stylized, very particular world. And it's interesting. One of the things I really like about Zack Snyder, especially his first films, Dawn of the Dead, 300, Watchmen, is that it is kind of an antidote to that Paul Greengrass, super shaky, Michael Bay, super hypercut, edited style, right? Where you have not long takes exactly, but coherent takes.
Right, you can actually see what's happening.
Right, and you've got these kind of shots that start in regular speed, then slow down, then speed up past regular speed, and then come back. And it does two things. First of all, in 300 and Watchmen, it creates the sense that you are kind of seeing a comic book brought to life. Right, it's like you have a panel, and then you have this quick movement that brings you to another panel, and then so on and so forth. I was actually a little bit saddened to see some of that go in Man of Steel. A lot of people were saying, "Oh, no more slow-mo. That's a great thing." I disagree slightly. I think
there could be more of a balance, and I do think we got some of that sort of bounce. I hesitate to call it bouncy, but that's how it sort of feels to me. Cinematography in the sequence where Clark Kent flies for the first time and really sort of becomes Superman. And you had that sense of physical scale when he sort of crash lands through a mountain, but you also just had this sense of, speed and stop. There's this sort of escalation in the physical movement itself in a way that I thought was really lovely.
Mm-hmm. It's a nice partner to the scene in the first Spider-Man film where Sam Raimi kind of takes you through the rooftops, spinning,
Yes.
Going from building to building, except this time it's from continent to continent because we're on a much larger scale.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, where we've been talking about Zack Snyder primarily in terms of his sort of fight choreography and action sequences, but I wonder if part of the problem with Man of Steel is that people just don't like Zack Snyder, and I think you and I are among the few people who really consistently do. And, I'd be curious to hear your take on it, because I sort of often feel alone in that interpretation. But I've kind of been rooting for the guy for a long time.
I would say we're definitely two of the bigger Zack Snyder apologists out there.
We're not apologists. We are, we have a well-grounded series of ideas supporting, etc. You go first.
I do think he's slightly misunderstood. For instance, I wrote a piece a couple weeks back in the run-up to Man of Steel that talked about how he's actually a very optimistic filmmaker. A lot of the times you get this sense from people, like talking to people, they think he is, kind of either nihilistic or, just dedicated to this kind of showy violence porn. And I don't think that's the case. And I want to go back to Dawn of the Dead, his first big film. And let's think about that for a minute. We've got, in the original Dawn of the Dead, remember, it's basically about how man and society tears itself apart, right? Yes. You've got these people who are cooped up in a mall, and they come to hate each other, and the outside world comes crashing in to take all their stuff. And, it's this kind of critique of man's inability to live with man. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about Dawn of the Dead is, the Zack Snyder Dawn of the Dead, is that it took almost the exact opposite tack, where you had a group of outsiders who were, kind of distrustful and fearful at first, and then they learn to come together, and they form a society within the mall. And it's not, everything falls apart, but it doesn't fall apart because outside humans are trying to break in and take their stuff. It falls apart because they're trying to rescue a guy across the street, separated from them by an ocean of zombies. it is. I mean, it's a very, as I say, it's a very optimistic kind of take on humanity, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people, miss that. They just were focused on the extremely good zombie feature shots and that sort of thing. But there is kind of a moral.
There's a moral universe to his work.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And and again, people ignore this. They set it aside because it's all action sequences and slow-mo fights and arms getting chopped off and that sort of thing. But I think that's a mistake.
Well, one thing that I've always found interesting about Snyder, and I was sort of thinking about this, is that I sort of agree with you on the sort of societal optimism. I also think that his work sort of in the action genre poses some really interesting challenges to genre conventions, including the idea that the hero either survives to the end or sort of survives emotionally and psychologically intact to the end. And I think Sucker Punch, his movie that is about sort of women in a 1960s insane asylum, has been sort of broadly misunderstood as like sort of schoolgirl porny action, when in the structure of the movie is this sort of really radical challenge to male-centric action, which is this understanding that not everybody gets to make it to the end, particularly not in the sort of within the constraints that the characters are fighting against, both in the real world asylum where they're imprisoned and in the sort of realm of the imagination to which they're withdrawing, and where they fight these sort of epic battles. And, Rocket, one of the characters, dies to save her sister, and then Baby Doll, who's sort of the main character, this woman who was sort of falsely incarcerated by a man who wants to steal her family's fortune, she literally undergoes a voluntary transorbital lobotomy to provide a distraction so her friend can escape. I mean, it is this sort of astonishing act of self-sacrifice for someone else, and it's a hero who's not just sort of dying in battle, but is she's giving up her own brain so her friend can have sort of physical and psychological autonomy and not sort of be severed from herself. And that's a really radical way to have an action movie end, for the hero to go out not fighting, but sort of agreeing to be maimed to save someone else. And, we see some of that in Superman, too, right? I mean, in Man of Steel, too, right? I mean, we have all of the Marvel action movies in which everybody makes it to the end, and there's this there are these jokey asides after entire cities have gotten pulverized. I mean, the action in Man of Steel ends with Superman crying, He's had to do this horrible, emotionally traumatizing thing that was correct, but the idea that he sort of made it through all of this intact and has sort of arrived at hero-dom like a jaunty, celebratory way is, I think, really challenged in the movie in a way that I thought was very interesting.
Sure, and you see the same thing in 300, of course, where the Spartans sacrifice themselves so democracy and the Western ideals can survive.
Yeah.
The thing I find most interesting, and all of the points you made are very good and right. You mentioned Sucker Punch, which again I think is one of those films that you and I and about three other people are the only
see
people
anything in
who are willing to publicly defend it. And what was really interesting, I thought, about that film was the kind of the various tricks that Snyder was playing on perspective and point of view, and it was almost literary in a way, weaving the various realities into each other, but also, like you say, kind of toying with our expectations of what will happen to the hero of the picture.
Yeah.
And really, who is even the hero? Who is actually the protagonist of that picture? Is it Baby Doll? Is it the character, whose name I forget, who actually escapes there at the end?
Yeah.
Is it one of the things we get so focused on the central character of any work of fiction, right? We get focused on, the main characters of our novels, of our movies, of our TV shows, that we forget that all of the other characters have their own lives.
Yes.
Like, they're all the main star of their own show. Just because we're not focused on it doesn't mean, it doesn't, and it's kind of a weird perspective, like almost Philip K. Dick kind of shift to think about this sort of thing, but, just because we start on Baby Doll, that doesn't mean that she is the only person in this universe.
Yes. Well, and I think that actually gets at something really interesting about sort of Man of Steel in the larger superhero context. Because one of the things that we've seen in superhero movies, particularly in the Marvel universe, although hopefully this will get better with Avengers too, is that women in the current crop of superhero movies have existed sort of almost solely in relationship to the heroes' either destruction or self-actualization. I think we have Black Widow, who's kind of an exception in the Marvel universe, but isn't even sort of, doesn't get substantial screen time by herself to do anything else. She exists sort of as part of this unit, and everyone else, is the girlfriend, and she's the person that the hero comes home through to, the person by whom he achieves emotional connection to Earth in the form of Thor, someone who sort of challenges his focus in the form of Pepper Potts, and it's actually gotten to the point where I would rather just see some, like, bro movies in the superhero genre than watch another woman be nothing but a girlfriend. And, one of the things that I enjoyed about Man of Steel, while not thinking it was perfect, was that, Lois Lane has her own interests, right? I mean, she has a job she cares about a lot, she has a reputation that she cares about a lot, and that she's sort of allowed to be transgressive in pursuit of, right? Like, she breaks some rules, she drops, publishes this story elsewhere, she kind of causes some trouble. And, she and Superman kind of have the kiss at the end, but, she has interests and agency and an arc, and that is just so incredibly rare in superhero movies these days. She is not an accessory. She makes things happen because she goes looking for them. And, I think there are fair debates about the ways that Snyder's cinematography captures women. I think that said, his women have much more agency and complexity and screen time than in, the work of almost any other action picture director working. It's, I think there's a conundrum there, but it's real.
I think that's very true. I mean, and I read your kind of critique of Matt Zoller-Seitz's review of the film, and I'm with you. I don't quite understand how he comes away from that film thinking that women play no part and aren't kind of fully realized characters. And this is something that Zack Snyder is very good at. The kind of foreground critique of Sucker Punch is that, it's just, for the male gaze, you've got these, girls dressed up in schoolgirl outfits and playing with big guns and stuff. And I think that's, a not fair critique, and also just a very shallow critique. Look back to, like, 300, for instance, where the only major departure that he made from Frank Miller's text was to increase the role of Queen Gorgo, right? So, yeah. She has an entire subplot that he came up with that he, brought to life, and it involves her kind of getting the Spartan Council to do what is right, she takes a lot of she takes on a lot of responsibility and a lot of action, and it's this is all him. And I've never quite understood the Zack Snyder hates women critique. It confuses me. Like many of the critiques of Zack Snyder, it confuses me.
Yeah, I mean, Warner Brothers at the time that Sucker Punch was greenlit had a sort of an unofficial policy of not making movies where women were the main characters because they believed they didn't sell. And Sucker Punch didn't do tremendously well commercially, but it got made, and it was something he cared about. And I think under-discussed in these conversations is that, Snyder's wife has been his producer, his producing partner on a lot of his movies. And, we can talk about what it means that they're married or whatever, but I mean, he's one of the few sort of men directing action movies, again, who has a, substantial relationship with a female collaborator with whom he presumably shares ideas and interests. it's a strange conversation, and I don't, I mean, I think that you and I may differ a little bit on, sort of costuming and photography, but I do think that I wish that people who criticize Snyder for putting women in a lot of short skirts, or, even for the way he filmed sexual assault scenes, which I thought was very, effective and scary and upsetting, and sort of made the rapists look really horrible in both Watchmen and 300, would recognize that, the women he puts in, like, little outfits, frankly, come back and sort of upset fantasies, I mean, Baby Doll isn't there to, get down on her knees for you in her schoolgirl outfit. She's there with a katana and she's going to kill you. And I think, again, you can make that critique. Man of Steel is the only superhero movie sort of other than the Spider-Man movies, which, because they involve younger characters, this might not necessarily have been appropriate. It's one of the only superhero movies where everybody gets to keep their clothes on. I mean, Faora is like, neck to feet in a black jumpsuit. Unlike the Avengers, which spend a substantial amount of time gazing at Black Widow's ass for us, Faora just gets to be a warrior. She's a woman, but, she is not reduced to being a sexual object at any point. And, these are choices. And at some point you have to give Snyder for the credit for the ones that are good, as well as just sort of picking at him for the things that don't work as well.
Yeah, I think that's all very true. You're not gonna get a ton of disagreement from me on that.
One thing I was curious to talk to you about is, and this is very much sort of shows up in Man of Steel, is that there's been this trope this summer, remarked on by writers from Vulture and the Atlantic Wire and a couple of other places, that we've gotten sort of weird about mass casualties in superhero movies. I mean, New York just gets destroyed in the Avengers. In Star Trek Into Darkness, Khan just plows the ship through most of San Francisco, presumably not leaving people a whole bunch of time to evacuate. Metropolis gets leveled first by, World Machine, and then by Zod and Superman sort of whipping each other around and through buildings and causing all sorts of trouble. Do you think our action movies are getting indifferent to civilian casualties? Is the scale getting too big? I mean, that's something that I've been sort of turning over in my head, but I can't decide if it upsets me or not. The one thing that gets me about it is the more destruction a villain commits, the more justified the hero is in just, like, doing really physically awful things to him. But I'm not quite sure I think of it as sort of an offensive 9/11 reference, or, sort of callous in the way that some other writers do, and I've been trying to think through that.
Sure. The Star Trek Into Darkness case is an interesting one because, so you have Khan crashing the ship into San Francisco and leveling a whole bunch of buildings, and I would presume killing tens of thousands of people. It looks very dense. They've solved their density problem in the future. But and then it cuts ahead to, 9 months later or a year later or whatever, and everything's just kind of like, new ship, we're all happy. And I thought that was kind of a cop-out. I thought it was just a weird way to handle what should have been a pretty traumatic event. Now, what I think will be interesting is to see how they handle the destruction of Metropolis in the inevitable Man of Steel sequel. I think that you have Nolan and Goyer, who are, I think, pretty good about using the city. Certainly in the Batman films, they were very good about using the city as a character in itself, and saying, this is how Batman's actions would affect the people who live in this city. Yeah. And, if there isn't some sort of subplot where, at the very least, if people aren't looking at Superman at least slightly warily after the events of, the destruction of Metropolis, or if there isn't some sort of question being raised about, how are we going to handle this? Is this going to be a regular thing? I think it'll be kind of a cop-out, but, that's, we'll see in 2 years or 3 years whenever the sequel comes out.
Well, it also opens up some interesting space for Lex Luthor, right? Because, we see sort of some LexCorp trucks in the movie, And, if you make the actual rebuilding of Metropolis the story in the second movie, if Lex Luthor sort of steps up and does some of the work for free, if, Superman kind of withdraws for a while and Luthor comes in and sort of meets this immediate physical need, there could be a really interesting sort of conversation there about what needs superheroes can and can't meet. I mean, Matt Iglesias wrote at Slate that, Superman shouldn't be beating up bad guys, he should be generating electricity. And that's actually the sort of interesting question that the destruction of Metropolis could open up.
Sure.
I'd like to... Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think that there is actually a subplot in The Dark Knight Strikes Again, or whatever, Frank Miller's sequel to The Dark Knight Returns, in which the Flash has literally been imprisoned by, I'm pretty sure, Lex Luthor, and is running on a treadmill to generate power for all of America. Wow. And obviously it would be a slightly different thing with Superman,
just a little bit.
But I think that you could, again, I don't want to write the movie for them, but I think if you ignore the opportunity to set up Lex Luthor as a reasonable demagogue who says, this is an untenable state of affairs, and we need to actually have a sit down with Mr. Superman and figure out what exactly we're going to do to A, fix this, and B, keep it from happening again, and see how Lex can turn this to his advantage. He is an evil genius after all. Then I think you're really missing out. I think that this sets up kind of a perfect opportunity, in the same way that the same way that Batman Begins kind of set up this perfect opportunity for kind of reimagining of the Joker character. You're just really missing out here. But again, it's not my movie, so
yeah. I mean, I think part of the challenge is that even in the movies where we're getting something like Iron Man 3, or the Iron Man franchise, or any of the sort of Marvel movies where they're making a couple movies and then going back into the Avengers ensemble pictures, all of these stories are still kind of origin stories, for the most part. Nobody's ever getting creative with their powers, no one's ever figuring out anything more they can do with them. Tony Stark sort of walks away from being Iron Man at the end of the third Avengers movie, but I'm sure he'll be there. But nobody, it's the same sort of set of challenges over and over again. Like, how hard can I punch people? What happens when someone shows up that I need to punch in a different way? Do I need a different suit to punch this person?
Yeah.
And I'm being a little bit facetious, but, I think that we have this real problem in that we've kind of tied superhero characters to superhero genre pictures, and what we understand a superhero genre picture to be is sort of a 3-arc origin story, or a 3-act origin story. And that kind of storytelling is getting pretty old. I don't know what your reaction was to Iron Man 3, but I was just sort of like, this again? Okay.
Yeah, Iron Man 3, I thought the first 2 acts were great. I thought the total inconsistency in how they dealt with the extremist powered villains was extremely frustrating to me. I just didn't understand. I didn't understand how they worked. Like, first of all, I didn't really understand what their powers were, other than they could regrow the limbs and they could kind of breathe fire sometimes, and none of it really made too much sense to me. But no, I think you're right. The problem with any of these hero movies is that the first one is set building the universe, and some movies do this better than others. I thought Hellboy, for instance, did a really good job of kind of creating that universe. And maybe it helped that I didn't have any. I had never read the Hellboy books, and everybody knows who Superman and Batman and Spider-Man are, and how they got their powers. But and this is why the second film is oftentimes so much better than the first, Spider-Man 2 and The Dark Knight, and etc. Iron Man 2 was actually not as good as Iron Man 1, but there's an exception to every rule, I guess.
But but people have some knowledge, and so you can play around with it a little bit more.
Right.
Yeah, and I wish, I almost wish that we could stop doing origin stories altogether. I mean, I wish we could make, this is something I wrote about a little bit earlier in the week, but I think that we need, to sort of detach superhero characters from, superheroes are people, but you can tell many genred stories about them. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I was so disappointed that FX's attempt to adapt Powers didn't work out, because that's superheroes, but it is a noir story. It's, there are bits of origin stories woven in, but, the premise is simple, and it's one that we basically understand from The Incredibles. There's a world where people have superpowers, they're not allowed to use them, sometimes this causes problems. And I almost wonder if, people think that audiences need more information than they actually do. I mean, I don't know if it's a matter of just trusting audiences to get some of the basic dynamics, which seem to be pretty well culturally understood at this point, and, jumping off a little bit.
Yeah. I think it would be an interesting experiment to just kind of take a superhero that nobody knows and throw us into their universe. Yeah. The obvious problem with this all goes back to funding and sales, right? Like, I'm reading this new book on Hollywood sales, The New Abnormal. It's kind of floating around. And, the whole point of these big superhero movies is that they come with pre-awareness, right? You've got these characters that everybody knows, and that's why we're making a $200 million movie about them, because we can sell it not just here but also overseas. And it would be, I think it would be kind of a cheat to use one of those characters with this, because like I said, everybody knows who Superman, Spider-Man, and Batman are. Maybe we can do it with the Flash. What's his deal? I can't remember. But I think you're right. I think it would be an interesting, at the very least, kind of a neat experiment to see if it would work.
Yeah, I mean, there's, you've written about some of the financial failures of superheroine movies. And I mean, I would quibble with you a little bit in terms of sort of, I think we had a crop of exceptionally badly done superheroine movies that made the genre look less financially viable than it could in the current context. But, one thing I've always thought would work, and that has been sort of a joke at this point, is that I've always thought you can make a really smart She-Hulk television show. Because She-Hulk is Bruce Banner's cousin. She gets shot. There's a transfusion. She gets all his powers and none of his rage issues. And there's a really smart arc by Dan Slott called Superhuman Law, where She-Hulk gets kicked out of the Avengers for partying too much and habitually trashing the Avengers mansion, and then he gets hired to start up a branch of a new, white shoe law firm, practicing superhuman law. I mean, law that is occasioned by the presence of super people in the world. So she does things like sue J. Jonah Jameson for libel on behalf of Spider-Man and has Peter Parker testify. She sues a company where an industrial accident turned a guy into a superhero in ways that have been really inconvenient. Like, his strength means he keeps wrecking things in his house. He accidentally, really hurts his wife when he tries to hug her, and ends up winning a wrongful death suit because the old entity is gone and they've created something else entirely. You could do it really low budget. You could do it in a convention that people are very comfortable and familiar with, because we're really comfortable with lady lawyers prosecuting things from Law and Order. And it would just be different, but it would be something other than, industrial accident, powers, Uncle Ben gets shot, has a sad, saves the world.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally true. I would totally watch the She-Hulk, Ally McBeal. I think that would be fantastic. And I do think that the studios and, I guess Warner Brothers and Disney at this point are missing out on what they could do with the Marvel and DC characters on HBO or Showtime or one of those channels. I remember, back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a very short-lived series called Damage Control that Marvel put out that was basically about this firm that it basically paid out insurance on the super destructive events that happen during the course of superhero stories. And it was like kind of hilarious. It's just a very funny concept that you could do a different one every week. It's like, well, how do we determine, what the payout for the destruction of, this 6-block stretch of New York by the Hulk fighting the Abomination was. Like you could do it in ways that are both kind of serious and kind of funny, and bring in that whole dynamic of real world applications of superhero silliness. But
if this is the world we're going to live in culturally for a long time, at some point we have to figure out how to tell different stories within it, because it's a shame to do all of this world building work and then just tell the same story over and over again.
Yep.
The waste.
Yep.
Speaking of things that are a waste or complicated or something, so this week we obviously have the release of Kanye West's new album, which I'm still sort of working my way through and shaping my thoughts around. But the sort of other big piece of music news is that Samsung bought 3 million advance copies of Jay-Z's new album to distribute for free to users. And it gets at something that you've written about before that I find really interesting, which is the concept of sort of patronage as a way out of the studio system. Obviously, I think we've seen a real concentration of studio movies and sort of very expensive blockbusters that hopefully produce big results, if not like when something like John Carter happens, there's a disaster, and then in increasingly small number of vibrant, interesting, but, harder to get distributed independent movies. And then we're starting to see celebrities, even people who could fund projects independently, turn to sites like Kickstarter to try and find some way out to, raise money for other projects. And you suggested something that I thought was really smart, which was that we need to have a sort of patronage system for filmmakers in a way that we haven't really for a long time. And you pointed to the example of Megan Ellison, who, with her father's money, has been funding things like Zero Dark 30, among other projects. She's putting up a third of the money for the new Terminator movie. Her brother also effectively runs a film fund. And, I'm curious, because I obviously think it's promising for artists to get chunks of money that let them keep creating and let them keep creating things that aren't necessarily what the distribution system would sort of incentivize them to produce. But, I do think it's interesting to consider that, a company like Samsung is going to have very different interests than someone with sort of Megan Ellison's idiosyncratic and I think really important taste. But I still think it, even if it'll be a more wide open landscape, I'm curious to see how you think sort of a sponsor or patron model might affect what we end up seeing.
Sure. Well, so the patronage model, I think it's a great model if you can find enough super wealthy people who are willing to, at the very least, take the chance of losing, 8 figures in a throw. Right? Yeah. Like, I really enjoy what Megan Ellison is doing. I think it's a fantastic experiment. I'm less convinced of the viability just because eventually she's going to run out of money. If she makes, a number of films. It's the same problem that the studios have, right? Like, you don't have a bottomless pit of money, but you do have a lot of it. So, you can, if you lose, betting on black 10 times, maybe it's the 11th time that bankrupts you. But, again, that being said, I think it's a really interesting model that kind of shakes up what is in the multiplexes, because just look at the things that she has kind of put the Annapurna picture stamp on, her company. It's Zero Dark 30, and also Lawless, and also Spring Breakers, and also The Master. I mean, it's a very eclectic group of films that, otherwise might have been made, but might not have received distribution. And that, you make Spring Breakers for $1 million, or
Yeah.
$500,000 or however much it costs, and it doesn't do you any good if you're just putting it out on DVD 6 months later, you know.
Yeah.
And this is what the Ellison model can help do, is bring it to audiences in theaters. The Samsung thing is interesting because it's, you know, Jay-Z's not going to have trouble getting his album made, right? This is like a bonus for Samsung customers. Like, maybe you're going to be one of the people who gets one of our million free copies, so you should download this app and share it. And like, it's basically a $5 million ad buy for Samsung, right? And I'm not sure that this is like a huge boon to creativity, so much as a cementing of somebody's status and you know, paying them for their past success.
Right. And I guess that what you said raises sort of two questions for me. I think, you know, the question is a patronage model really working if, you know, and I think that all the movies that Megan Ellison has backed are, you know, that you listed are extremely important movies, right? I mean, you know, I am not crazy about Harmony Korine's work, but I think it is interesting and has ideas and is visually exciting, and I'm glad that someone's giving him money to make it. I think that, you know, Zero Dark 30 is, you know, a tough, really, you know, it's a fantastic looking movie. I think it's a great picture. You know, Catherine Bigelow is a known quantity. The Master, you know, again, looks amazing in 65 millimeter and is sort of narratively eccentric. And Amy Adams is really having quite the couple of years, I must say, between The Master and Lois Lane in particular. But those are all artists who are fairly known quantities, right? And, you know, Jay-Z in his own way, again, a very known quantity who sort of people want to be in business with. And so, you know, I think there's a gain from patronage if, you know, known quantities make more difficult films with Megan Ellison than they could have made with Sony. But, you know, it still raises the question of how, you know, whether patronage selects new talent and sort of brings it to the market in a way that it wouldn't have before, or whether it sticks with people who are known quantities with sort of known quantities on the margin. And I think that's something it may take a while to sort out. And I guess the other question I have that I think, and this is where I think Ellison and other people could be really useful, is, you know, I mean, I think that studios like superhero pictures and like blockbusters because, you know, you can make hundreds of millions of dollars on a single movie. But I do think that what someone like, you know, Ellison does, and Ellison loses money on some movies. She lost money on The Master. But, you know, I mean, Zero Dark 30 has at this point made $137.7 million internationally at the box office. It's made another $12 million in DVD sales. You know, the movie cost $52 million to make. Let's add, I mean, what do you think the marketing was on that? 30 million?
You know, what's the average 30-something million at this point?
Yeah, so even, you know, even if the movie only made $40 million, that's still a pretty, you know, in pure profit, that's not a terrible return. You know, you can make tens of millions of dollars even on the smaller movies that the studios sort of aren't making, but people like Ellison are stepping up and making.
Sure.
And I just,
you know,
I'd like to restore the sense that, like, I would like Hollywood to remember that, oh, $10 million in pure profit is $10 million in pure profit, you know?
Sure.
I think that would be sort of a healthy thing for the industry to recognize again.
Yeah. You know, I do think I think you're right that the patronage model is kind of good for that second tier of filmmaker, right? Like, Christopher Nolan doesn't need a patron.
No.
I mean, he has a patron. He has, you know, Warner Brothers, and they basically let him do what he wants, which is good for him. But it's definitely great for that kind of second tier of, you know, the director who's going to make a film that grosses $30 or $40 million or $50 or $60 million. In terms of finding the new talent, you know, it's always been hard, right? Zack Snyder kind of appeared out of nowhere after doing commercials. Michael Bay is kind of the same thing, and you know, it's always been a crapshoot. I imagine it probably always will be, just especially since fewer and fewer movies are getting made every year. Yeah. But you know, one of the nice things about the advances in technology and other you know, stuff is you can make a movie for so cheap now that
Yes.
you can essentially put together your own sizzle reel and like, hey, here's this movie that I made for $80,000. It's not nothing, but you can swing that, or even less, or $10,000, $20,000, and that is, I think, helping bring forth this kind of this next generation of directors, like the Duplass brothers and those guys. They've got cable network TV shows and are making kind of quirky, smaller films that get a limited release and wind up on Netflix where everybody watches them.
I'd almost be curious to see Ellison or somebody else, endow some more slots at the Sundance Institute with sort of right of first refusal on buying the results if she likes them.
Sure.
It would be interesting to see, sort of talent development get farmed out a little bit. I'd be interested to see Megan Ellison sponsor a big short film competition and, pick a bunch of good stuff out of there. I think you're right that the lower barrier to entry financially has been a really good thing for movies. And just finding a way to, get people to make some of those investments on the lower end because, not everybody can pony up or come up with $80,000 for a feature. Not everybody can come up with $20,000 or $10,000 for a feature. And so, if Megan Ellison can spend $50 million making a Catherine Bigelow movie, you could give a lot of people $80,000 grants to go out and make some features.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting. I'd be excited to see what came out of that. And I understand that the financial incentives are lower, but, the Blair Witch Project was made for nothing,
Right. Didn't Amazon try to do that? Weren't they sponsoring? I may have totally imagined this. I thought Amazon was. Weren't they
Amazon just did a television development cycle where they had people watch sort of 8 pilots online and then greenlit 2 of them and greenlit some of the children's programming as well. But even there, they had a collaboration with Gary Trudeau. They had a collaboration with The Onion. It was not a lot of new talent. It was, and I think sort of predictably, they went with the Gary Trudeau show and they went with this show called Betas that will probably get them a lot of Silicon Valley product placement. It's,
right.
I understand it, but it's less interesting, and I think that, there's some, if we could encourage people to think that there's some cultural cachet in finding the next big thing, that would be a service we could do to the patrons out there. Well, look, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a great discussion, and hopefully we can convince Megan Ellison to find the next Zack Snyder somewhere out there. I think that's the takeaway.